They don't even pretend that there were weapons hidden in the mosques. And so far, no evidence has come forward. Israel also systematically targeted the minarets of the mosques in Gaza. And the minarets couldn't possibly have been a legitimate military target because they don't have staircases and they're too narrow for a person to scale. So they couldn't have been used as observation points. And the Dugard Commission, headed by the very smart and very decent South African jurist John Dugard, his commission concluded that the mosques, and more particularly the minarets, had been targeted on the grounds that they symbolized Islam. Now, a lot was said in defense of Israeli actions, and it continues to be said, that Hamas used civilians as human shields. And all the human rights reports were very careful to investigate that charge. All the human rights reports came to the same conclusion. So Amnesty International found, contrary to repeated allegations by Israeli officials of the use of human shields, Amnesty International found no evidence that Hamas or other Palestinian fighters directed the movement of civilians to shield military objectives from attacks. Amnesty found no evidence that Hamas or other armed groups forced residents to stay in or around buildings used by fighters. Amnesty International found no evidence that fighters prevented residents from leaving buildings or areas which had been commandeered by militants. On the other hand, there was ample evidence, most exhaustively documented by the Goldstone report, that Israel used Palestinians, including Palestinian children, as human shields. All of the human rights reports concluded that Israel committed multiple war crimes and possibly or definitely crimes against humanity. And they also conclude that Hamas committed comparable crimes, but at an incomparably smaller scale. And it should be obvious why it had to be on a smaller scale, because how many war crimes can an ant commit against a fellow with a magnifying glass? The Goldstone report was pretty tough in its conclusion. It said that what Israel did was a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. And that brings me now to the second half of my remarks, which will focus on what seems to be, at first glance, a perplexing question, namely, why all this fuss over the Goldstone report? The Israelis were obviously very upset by that report. If you take the liberal end of the spectrum, say Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who it's alleged in the U.S. that he's a historian, Michael Oren, he called the Goldstone report, he said it's worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers. And bear in mind that in Israel he's considered a sane voice. Then there's the Nobel laureate for peace, Shimon Peres. He called the Goldstone report a mockery of history. And he set out to set the historical record straight. And this is the historical record as Mr. Perez understands it. Quote, IDF, Israeli Army operations, are what brought economic prosperity in the West Bank, liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah, and enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. That's the Nobel laureate for peace. So the question arises, why the fuss over the Goldstone report? Because it was actually the last in a long series of reports on what happened in Gaza. Reports by very reputable organizations, both global organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and local organizations, both in the occupied territories and in Israel. And if you look at the report itself, on some points it's a little bit weaker than the other human rights reports. For example, Goldstone does not categorically state that Israel's use of white phosphorus was a war crime, which was, I thought, a disappointment. On the other hand, there were aspects of the Goldstone report which were really quite impressive. First of all, contrary to what I think most people think, a large part of the report was given over to attacking the whole occupation. It wasn't just devoted to Gaza. There were large sections which focused on not only the occupation, but also Israel's treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel, which he calls discriminatory. And he even has two references, amazingly enough. There are two references in the report to the Palestinian right of return. But that's not, in my opinion, the main reason the report evoked such a hysteria in Israel. The main reason, it seems fairly clear, is who was the messenger. Mr. Goldstone, apart from being a renowned international jurist, he chaired significant investigations in South Africa and then was the chief prosecutor for the war crimes tribunals on Rwanda and Yugoslavia. But apart from his professional reputation, there is the personal aspect to Mr. Goldstone. Namely, he calls himself a Zionist. He supports Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in Palestine. He sits on the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received an honorary degree through the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He says he's worked his entire adult life, has been devoted to work for Israel. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter made Aliyah to Israel. And so Goldstone was, as the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, he was propaganda-proof, which is to say that for the past several decades, Israel has honed two main weapons in order to discredit and silence criticism of Israel. Number one, to claim that the critic is an anti-Semite, or in the case of a Jew, a self-hating Jew, or to claim that the critic is a Holocaust denier. But then comes along this fellow named Mr. Goldstone, and he just doesn't have the profile, or credibly, he doesn't have the profile of being an anti-Semite. He says he's a Zionist, and he says he loves Israel. And he doesn't seem to be a self-hating Jew. And he says that he began his whole career in international law because of the Nazi Holocaust, that was his main inspiration. So that doesn't sound like a Holocaust denier. And now Israel has a real problem on their hands. If he's not an anti-Semite, and he's not a self-hating Jew, and he's not a Holocaust denier, and he's not a dupe and he's not a fool.